Is civil war coming to the United Kingdom and other parts of the West in the near future? For quite a few years now, as we've seen deepening divisions in society, I've occasionally had the dreadful thought that it might be. It feels like there's a pressure building in society and the democratic release valves are simply not functioning. In short, there's a growing feeling that the government has broken the social contract and thus is becoming illegitimate. The social contract says that legitimate political authority in democracies arises from the consent of the governed. Essentially, the people say, we voluntarily submit to that authority if in return the government works for the good of its own people. However, for quite some time now, the feeling has been growing that the government is no longer working for the good of its own citizens. In fact, the feeling has been growing that the government actively and quite nakedly despises its own citizens. Free speech is being suppressed. People are being arrested for silent prayer, essentially for thought crimes, potentially even in their own homes. They're throwing people in jail for tweets and sending menacing messages to the public not to post anything they disapprove of or that goes against the official narrative. Grandmothers are being intimidated by the police and visited at their homes for merely criticizing the government online. This is Soviet-level stuff. Two-tier justice that actively discriminates against the native British population is now being written into law. They aren't securing the borders despite continuous pleas from the natives to do so. Muslims commit countless terrorist attacks and the government never responds with any real purpose, but seems to be more concerned with warning Brits not to be quote-unquote Islamophobic. Islam in general is being pandered to at the expense of Christianity, as well as British culture and tradition. And when natives complain about any of this, the government, instead of addressing their valid concerns, only denigrates them with far-right slurs and warns them they will face punishment for protesting. On top of that, Britain is now becoming a poor country because of mass immigration and other globalist ideologies around energy and taxation. It's down to their policies that this is happening. It doesn't need to be this way. Civil war is something you don't want to talk about because there's this feeling that if you talk about it, somehow you speak it into existence and you make it more likely. You don't even want to say its name. But increasingly, it feels like we need to have this conversation and with some sense of urgency. It feels like the eyes of the world are increasingly falling on the UK as well as wider Europe. And with mouth agog at what's happening here, people are asking how much of this authoritarianism and government betrayal are they going to take? Is the government ever going to listen and change course? JD Vance and others have spoken about this in recent months.
I think that Europe, and frankly, I would have said this about America a year ago, but Europe is at risk, I think, of engaging in civilizational suicide. They are unable to, or unwilling, too many countries to control their borders. You see them starting to push back against that, and good, that's a good thing. You see them starting to limit the free speech of their own citizens, even as those citizens are protesting against things like the border invasion that got Donald Trump and a number of European leaders elected. So look, I want Europe to thrive. I want them to be an important ally. Part of that is going to be Europe respecting its own people, respecting its own sovereignty, and America can't do that job for them.
It's the ruling classes in these countries. They're globalist, and they need to be removed. And they will be removed. I'm confident that it will happen. The British have not had a real revolution since Cromwell, but I think they've reached a point now where they very much need a Cromwellian figure to clean house because the people ruling them are weak and inept.
Do you see any path to that happening?
I don't know. I haven't been to Britain for many years.
Really?
No, I have not. I think the last time I was in Britain was 2005.
Don't go. It'll make you too sad.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking to somebody who worships at the altar of English-speaking civilization.
Me too.
And I don't even want to think about it. But I think there are still enough Scots, Welsh, English, and Irish there who will stand up and be counted. All of the Europeans need to come to Jesus on this one. They need to come very, very soon. And that doesn't mean they're evil. It means that they're defending the one thing that is worth defending, which is their own country, their own nation, their own society. So I hope that that will happen. We need to do the same thing.
The reasons why I think we have to talk about this urgently are threefold. The first reason is that David Betz, a professor of war at King's College who specializes in civil wars and how they begin, has been speaking recently about how he thinks the UK is now explosively configured, to use his language, for civil war. And he thinks it's inevitable, it's going to happen within the next 5 years. His interview with Louise Perry has kind of blown up on YouTube recently. You've possibly seen it already. But if you haven't, I'll link it down below. And I want to, as briefly as possible, summarize what he said in that podcast in this video. So David Betz said that he first began to notice a problem around Brexit, where the people clearly voted for something, and then the entire political establishment and media as well worked together to make sure it didn't happen. That, he says, was when the alarm bells first began to ring for him. And it was for him the first sign that the government was breaking the social contract and becoming illegitimate.
This actually came to a head for me in the period after the Brexit vote, during the parliamentary shenanigans over how to implement the people's decision on that matter, where the people were consulted on it on a very specific matter of the national will. And it appeared, to my mind, as to many others, that the government was doing its best to subvert and otherwise avoid the implications of that decision, which clearly went against their own judgment about what was good for the country, or at any rate good for themselves.
Brexit was essentially an anti-globalist protest. For many years, the UK was gradually being absorbed into the European Union, which is a globalist project. And increasingly, just a law change here and a law change there, we were becoming governed not by democratically elected leaders in Westminster, but ruled by bureaucrats in Brussels. Now, the Brexit vote said to the world, we don't want that. We want to remain an independent nation state in control of our own destiny. And in that moment, it was shocking to see the entire political establishment mobilize and do everything they could to thwart the democratically expressed will of the British people. David Cameron resigned because he wanted nothing to do with it. Theresa May took over and she tried to water it down to nothing. Deals were made across all the parties to stop it happening. The media fought against it. The peers in the House of Lords fought against it. The deep state fought against it. And I think that was a real wake-up call for many people in Britain. People realized, look, the government is not on your side. They're not working for you. They're working for globalist elites. They're trying to impose a predetermined globalist agenda on the UK. They hoped that you'd go along with it willingly because that would preserve the illusion of democracy. But now you voted against it. That's kind of scuppered their plans, and they're forced to come out into the open and actively and nakedly work against your vote. That was a shock and the beginning of the erosion of the social contract. They then talk in the podcast about why Brits think a civil war simply couldn't happen here. And they basically say it's down to normalcy bias. That is, we haven't had any conflict on this island for hundreds of years. And that's allowed us to create a conceit of ourselves, an opinion of ourselves that we're simply too civilized for such things. And also, we're too financially well off for such things. Those are things that happen in other countries, poorer countries and less civilized countries. Those things couldn't happen to us. We're too polite. We're too well ordered. We're too well disciplined.
And I wonder if you could explain why this is such a long-standing assumption, is that we're not only too rich as societies now to have civil wars, but that we're also too old, that we're also too fat, that we basically don't have the countries in recent years that have seen this kind of conflict, like particularly countries in the Middle East, tend to be very youthful. They have youth bulges. Often they have that oversupply of young, aggressive men. We just we don't look like that anymore. That's not what our societies look like in the modern rich West. So I think the assumption has long been that therefore we couldn't see the kind of conflict that these other youthful societies have seen. Why do you think that assumption is so baked in, and why do you think that it's wrong?
There is a very strong normalcy bias within the British psyche, I would say, possibly more substantially than others, that the British have a self-conception of themselves as essentially peaceful. It is a society. It is a country which essentially invented, or feels that with some reason that it invented the idea of good government. We haven't had the kind of revolutionary turmoil which has plagued our European neighbors from time to time, France particularly, even up until very recent times. So by contrast, I think Britons conceive of themselves as essentially as rather peaceable, well-governed, cool-headed folk.
I don't think it should be underestimated just how much of a deterrent that would be to civil war in the UK. Brits do like to think of themselves as being these well-ordered, decent, polite, sensible, good chaps, and there's a bit of a pride, I guess, in that image. And it would be something of a national embarrassment for the world to see us acting in such an unseemly manner. I think it would also cause something of an identity crisis, because if we're not these well-ordered good chaps, then who exactly are we? Betz says, however, that overriding that conceit of ourselves are all those things I spoke about at the beginning of this video. The growing authoritarianism, the suppression of free speech, the two-tier justice, refusing to defend the borders, refusing to act on Islamic terror attacks, favouring Islam over British culture, globalist policies designed to make us poorer, the high tax burden, the growing feeling that the government simply despises its own people and is working against them. And he says the most shocking breakdown of the social contract to date came with the grooming gang scandal. This is where it was discovered that Pakistani Muslim men were systematically targeting young white British girls for abuse and rape, and the state effectively shielded them. They knew it was happening, but they didn't intervene, effectively sacrificing young British girls on the altar of multiculturalism.
The really important thing about industrial rape gangs, as you call them, Rotherham and other instances of these. It's that I wrote a whole essay about this terminology issue. It's so difficult because people so often say grooming gangs, right? And so grooming gangs is the term that is best understood, but it also really doesn't capture what's going on. And one of the consequences of this phenomenon, I agree with you, is it really undermines government legitimacy more so than other scandals you care to name, Jimmy Savile, Catholic sex abuse, whatever. They don't undermine government legitimacy in the way that this one does, because the widespread perception, not least among locals who've been particularly affected by these gangs, is that this was enabled by the state and that the state has permitted this to happen to its own people and is continuing to do so. That is a very widespread perception. And frankly, I think that it's true.
The very same people who failed little girls in towns like mine will punish those who try to speak out. I myself had the police show up at my door when I went on national TV to speak about grooming gangs. And when I said that it was still going on, and when I said that police were still turning a blind eye, the very next day, West Mercia police showed up at my doorstep and tried to demand that I go down to the police station with them for an interview. Because, quote unquote, when you go on TV to talk about grooming gangs, you should expect to hear from us. They try to threaten me and intimidate me into silence and try to penalise me for exposing their failings. Another survivor, Sammy Woodhouse, 4 or 5 days ago had a call from South Yorkshire Police saying that she had to remove Twitter posts speaking about her story, her life experience as a victim of Pakistani Muslim child exploitation, because it was going to jeopardize a case and she could potentially be held in contempt of court. And sharing publicly available information that had been reported on the BBC and national news, they target anyone who dares to go against the established narrative.
When a government turns on its own people like this, the official term used is downgrading. And Betz says that according to all the literature on the subject, and from what we know from history, downgrading a native population is the most powerful predictor of a coming civil war. He says that when people feel downgraded by their own government, they will start to engage in what he calls systems disruption. In order to control, surveil, and intimidate the population, the government relies on technology, and Betz says that people will then naturally try to disrupt that technology. An early example of this, he says, is the way people have been attacking ULEZ cameras in recent years. These are cameras designed to track movement in and out of cities and tax people with high-emission vehicles. Groups of people known as Blade Runners have started pulling these down and vandalizing them. And this signals to Betz that the people now see their government as illegitimate, and the process towards a civil war is beginning.
ULEZ is a camera system, right? So it's a highly connected camera system, and it is therefore exemplary of the surveillance state, essentially. And here I think we can circle back to legitimacy. Mm-hmm. Legitimacy is a tremendously important idea, but one that's highly under-theorized. It's really difficult to define what people mean when they say legitimacy. We talk about it. I mean people like me who've been looking at insurgency and counterinsurgency. We talk about legitimacy all the time, but definitions of it are quite complicated because it's not just legality. Problem is, it overlaps with legality, but it's not exactly the same thing. I tend to think of legitimacy as a kind of it's a kind of magic that makes a government work. Mm-hmm. It is the key variable that determines whether your cost of government is high or low. If you have high legitimacy, then your cost of government is very low. People tend to do the correct thing voluntarily, and your symbols of power are in fact powerful. So coats of arms, flags, policemen's badges, these things have a kind of material power in a high legitimacy system because that magic is working. When legitimacy collapses, then your government costs are very high. You have to police everything. You have to watch people because they won't do the right thing. And indeed, if people are really off, as soon as they're unobserved, they'll do the wrong thing. They'll do things to further kludge up the system because they're angry. In the current context, I think that governments around the world have been persuaded by certain factors and by certain people, notably the tech sector, to believe that they can make up for the problems of cost of governance in a low legitimacy environment through technology. Mm-hmm. That surveillance is going to bring down the well-known increased costs of governing in a low legitimacy environment. Mm-hmm. The problem there is the one that the ULEZ guys are really demonstrating, is that the whole of the kind of electronic surveillance architecture has as its Achilles heel that you can break it. You can cut the cameras down, or to my point, I think once things get really serious, you switch off the electricity. None of that is going to work if you can't power those systems. Mm-hmm. And at a certain point, I feel it is likely, very likely, if not inevitable, that enough people are going to recognize this, and they're going to start breaking the surveillance architecture on a rather large scale. And so that isn't just going to be cutting down cameras, ULEZ cameras in the dead of night, or actually they often do it in the middle of the day, but it is going to be rather larger than that. So there's no way out for the government. They can't, either they restore their perception of legitimacy somehow. That's going to be very difficult. That will take a generation to accomplish if they start today, which they show no sign of doing. Mm-hmm. Or their costs of government are going to climb very substantially while their wealth goes down. So you can work out the mathematics of this. Will become a very much more heavily policed society, which is very much poorer than it is. And there you go.
As they get towards the end of the podcast, Betz starts saying that what the British government are doing to the people is so obviously going to cause a civil war that it's almost like they're doing it on purpose, which I thought was a very interesting comment. He says, there's a lot of literature on how civil wars begin, it's well understood, and it's almost like they're following a playbook.
Does the government realise quite how likely this is? Is that why, for instance, the crackdown on the summer rioters was so harsh, that there is a recognition that actually this is a tinderbox? Or do you think that actually they don't really, maybe they instinctively fear kind of nativist politics, but they don't quite realise how dangerous the situation truly is?
It is very perplexing. Perplexing is not the word. It's dismaying for a person like me who has been involved, as I said, in the study of counterinsurgency, in dialogue with government on this matter for 20 plus years. The way in which and there are lots of people, I've had many, many interlocutors over that period of time who understand this very, very well. There are people in the British Army and in the security services who understand all of this extremely well. They have lived it. They've lived it. It's written down in their doctrine, and it's taught in the staff colleges and so on and so forth. Then you look at the actions of the British government, and it seems like they're following some kind of game plan for destroying legitimacy. Or I shouldn't use the word game plan, because that implies a directedness that I'm not sure is there. But certainly, if you want to create domestic turmoil in a society, then what the British government has been doing is almost textbook exactly what you would do, okay? And that's according to our own written down doctrinal understanding of things. So how to explain this disconnect about the rather sophisticated, rather long-term individual and institutional understanding of the causes of conflict in distant countries, with the way in which within the military, within the Ministry of Defense, within other parts of government, people understand this, with the way our governments behave domestically. There is quite obviously a disconnect. And I can't explain what government is thinking in doing this, but empirically it's just simply a statement of fact that they are doing the things that are leading us to civil conflict according to our own well-established ideas about what causes civil conflict.
You mentioned normalcy bias earlier. I agree that I think that's a very important factor. Like you, I have no idea what's going on in Keir Starmer's mind, but in thinking of people I know in positions of influence professionally, you remember when Musk, during the summer riots, tweeted civil war is inevitable? And that was treated by very many people in sort of British establishment as so preposterous that it ought to be criminalised almost, that it was this terrible thing to say and so ridiculous. And I must say, I read that tweet and I thought, yeah.
He's correct.
Yeah.
I'm not Elon Musk either. I mean, maybe, lots of people say things that are correct by coincidence, or, maybe whether or not he's worked it out. But the statement as such is correct. This is super typical of revolutionary situations in which the establishment, the representatives of the status quo, fail to comprehend their peril. They overestimate their strengths. They underestimate the depth of animus towards them as it's brewing. Sometimes in a contemptuous way. I mean, you hinted at this earlier when you talked about the older society, fatter, wealthier, so on and so forth. The truth of the matter is, I do think that there is a strong belief in the power of what the Romans were talking about when they talked about the political use of bread and circuses. You distract the population with cheap entertainments, and you meet their minimum welfare conditions. And as a result of this, you can essentially you can mollify the mass. That isn't actually in practice quite true. But nonetheless, the belief in it by the status quo, I think, is pretty strong. In the contemporary context, I think there is faith, perhaps, or a wish to see that potential to mollify the mass being delivered through cheap entertainments. In our case, Netflix, Pornhub, narcotics, drugs, both prescription and non-prescription. It is a highly medicated society. A substantial fraction of the population is kept sane through antidepressants. A substantial fraction of specifically our young boys and young men are kept docile through medication. I don't doubt there's a hope that this can continue. I suspect that it cannot. I think that people are waking up, to use the predictable phrase. They are literally becoming woke, and they're thinking that this is a bad bargain. And an iPhone and an endless diet of porn and cheap processed food and drugs is a very inferior substitute for actual freedom, actual individual agency, actual relationships with actual people. And when they come to that realization, they're going to be very...
Okay, so if you were advising the British government in this instance, what could they do? What ought they to do immediately to try and head off the risk of this escalation?
Well, in short, I don't think there's anything they can do.
Okay.
That's not a good question for me to answer, because I've come strongly to believe that there isn't really anything left to do.
It's too far gone.
It's too far gone.
So that's David Betz' analysis, but I did say there were two other reasons why I feared this could happen soon. The first is that Keir Starmer has started talking persistently about conscripting British men to go fight Russia in Ukraine in what could well be the start of World War III. If he were to try that, and if we had press gangs touring the country forcing men into the military, I think such is the level of animosity to this government that it would spark a civil war. I think there's something to the bread and circuses idea that many British men are mollified by having their basic needs met, and right now they've simply got too much to lose. They've got their house, their job, their wives, their families. However, if the government were to say, well, we're going to send you to die in Ukraine, we're going to send you into that meat grinder anyway, I think the majority would then say, well, now we've got nothing left to lose. If we're going to die anyway, then we'd rather do it trying to reclaim our own country. I think a lot of people are basically saying the cheek of this man to treat us like this and then expect us to go die for him. It's simply not going to happen. I think that would spark a civil war. And it could happen any day now if the media is to be believed. And then the third and final reason this could happen in the next 5 years is that many were holding on to the idea and the hope that reform, led by Nigel Farage, would offer a democratic way out of this. Many have been feeling that if they can just hunker down to the next general election in 2029, they can vote their way to freedom. However, Reform have recently started to disillusion their supporters. A Muslim donor has now become the chair of the party. Farage has started rejecting ideas of deportations. He suspended Rupert Lowe, who challenged him on this. There's been a split. There's a feeling that they've been compromised. And now it's less clear that Reform are going to be the answer. Betz says he sees this happening across Europe, where divisions are just as deep, maybe in Canada and the US as well, where people have started attacking Teslas. So the pressure doesn't seem to be dissipating. And I've been wrestling with this for quite some time, a week or more. You may have noticed that I'm late posting this video. I normally post a few days earlier than this in the week. I've been wrestling about whether to even talk about this, what to do about this. So basically, I'm landing on the idea that I'm coming to the Fuel Project community and asking, what do you think about this? Give me your insight, give me your thoughts. I think we have some wise people out there who understand these issues really very well. Right now, the only thing that I can think about to do is to pray and ask God to intervene and show a way out of this. I have no romantic ideas of war whatsoever. I did war poetry at school, Dulce decorum est pro patria mori and all that. I just want to live in peace. But these feel like genuinely perilous times, and I think what Betz was saying made sense, and I think we need to discuss. Tell me what you think. Is this possible? And if so, as Christians, most of all, as Christians, how do we respond to all of this?